Stephen Kinnock.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I'd like to start by associating myself with the Minister's comments about PC Keith Palmer, who died in the line of duty and whose tragic passing is something this House will never forget. This bill has been brought forward against the backdrop of an asylum and immigration system which is simply not fit for purpose. The British people want and deserve a system which is fair, compassionate and orderly. And it's been made abundantly clear by the fact that more than 150,000 households have signed up to house refugees fleeing the horrors of Putin's barbaric war. But from the Windrush scandal to the botched Afghan resettlement schemes to its shambolic response on Ukraine, the Home Office has consistently failed to live up to the standards that the public rightly expect from their government. So we should not really be surprised by the fact that the bill before us today doesn't only fail to meet any of the challenges our migration system faces, it actively makes the situation worse. And that is why we on these benches rejected this bill in its entirety at second reading, and it is also why we support every one of the Lord's amendments that we are debating today, as each seeks to mitigate the worst excesses of this dreadful piece of legislation. Madam Deputy Speaker, the fact that the government was defeated fully 19 times in the other place is proof positive that this appalling piece of legislation is not fit for the statute book. Turning now to the specific reasons why our asylum and immigration system is so comprehensively broken, let's start with the most visible example, the small boats crisis in the English Channel. The number of desperate asylum seekers risking their lives by crossing the Channel on small boats has increased from 299 in 2018 to an eye-watering 28,526 in 2021, of which more than 3,000 were children, Madam Deputy Speaker. Yet Conservative ministers have failed to engage constructively with their French counterparts to tackle the people traffickers, so now the Home Secretary has resorted to criminalising vulnerable refugees who are fleeing war-torn countries like Ukraine. I will give way.
I thank my honourable friend for giving way. I've actually spoken to some asylum seekers, and they tell me about children. They tell me about the way in which they come to this country, and often it's their parents that are giving this money to traffickers, and actually they have no idea how the journey is going to commence. Would you agree with me that the government simply seems totally unaware of this and hasn't included this in their considerations at all?
Well, I thank my honourable friend for giving way. She's absolutely right, and there are many dreadful aspects to this whole story, but the way in which it impacts on children who are utterly innocent in all of this, who deserve nothing but our compassion and care, and yet they are not being treated with either of those values and principles, I think is something that really should make this government hang its head in shame. I will give way.
Honourable gentleman, I completely agree with him. It's wholly unsatisfactory for the boats coming across the Channel at the moment. He's just accused the government of having failed to engage satisfactorily with the French authorities, giving £54 million to the French to do something about it, requesting constantly meetings with the French Home Secretary and others which have been rebuffed. Where has not the government tried to engage constructively, and how would his party have engaged constructively, and with what practical suggestions actually to do something about it, rather than grandstanding every time he does it at the dispatch box?
I thank the honourable member for giving way. I guess what matters in this is results and outcomes. And the attempts that the government has made to engage have clearly failed. Now, I'm sure the honourable member will have his own view of why that might be, but perhaps insulting gratuitously our European partners and allies on a regular basis, as the Prime Minister does, is probably not helping the situation very much, I would gently suggest to him. Madam Deputy Speaker, a particularly disturbing aspect of this legislation is that it seeks to criminalise a person seeking asylum if they arrive into the UK without clearance. This means that if a Ukrainian person had brought their elderly parents to our country in the early days of the war, then under this legislation they would have been criminalised. Does the government not comprehend the horrors that refugees are fleeing from? We should not be seeking to criminalise refugees desperately looking for a new home. We should be seeking to go after the people traffickers. For this reason, we on these benches fully support Lord's Amendment 13, which removes this new offence.
He's making some very good points.
is it not the case that the only way to apply for asylum here in Britain is to come through an irregular route? Because there is no possibility of applying for asylum not in Britain. And so therefore the criminalisation is shutting off almost all legal routes to apply for asylum, because the only way to then get a pass to get to the UK would be to in effect make a false application to apply via a tourist route or another route to get to the country first of all, which then the government in a Kafkaesque way would say you have falsely applied because you came in via the wrong route. This is particularly pernicious, is it not?
Yeah.
I think my honourable friend, he's absolutely right. The whole thing smacks really of a kind of bureaucratic trickery, where every option is blocked off by some additional piece of bureaucracy, and this bill should have been an opportunity to try and unlock some of that, but instead it leaves us in stalemate. I will give way.
Further to the honourable gentleman's remarks about where people claim asylum and how that's processed, I thought apposite to this bill allows the claim to be processed elsewhere before people get here. That would be a very positive move, would it not, based on what the honourable gentleman said? It would also mean that people travelling through safe countries where they could claim asylum will be able to do so there and have their claims processed there.
I think what the honourable gentleman is referring to is the offshoring, but as we've seen, offshoring does not work. It's costing millions and millions in Australia. Every expert is panning the idea. So if I have understood the honourable gentleman's intervention correctly, I'm afraid it is simply a non-starter. We also support Lord's Amendment 6, which would remove the government's attempt to introduce differential treatment of refugees based on method of arrival. For instance, if a Ukrainian citizen were to flee and were to travel here across Europe while waiting for a government visa to office to open or a safe route to be provided, then this clause would make them a second-class refugee. In order to be a first-tier refugee, they'd have to have taken an aeroplane directly from Ukraine. This absurd technicality shows just how unjust this proposal is.
The honourable gentleman for giving way. I'm getting rather confused. The Labour Party seem to be saying that we shouldn't be removing pull factors that mean that people are willing to risk their lives crossing the English Channel and putting money into the hands of the people smugglers. Madam Deputy Speaker, what I want to know is what happened to the Labour Party, who back in 2004, Baroness Scotland, a Labour minister, said a person should seek protection in the first safe country where they have a chance to do so. What happened to that Labour Party?
Well, I thank the honourable gentleman for that intervention, but the reality is that what's required is a properly resourced and competent processing system so that when people come here, they can be processed quickly, and that would actually resolve so many of the issues that he is talking about. Arguably even more astonishingly, Madam Deputy Speaker, Clause 38 appears to criminalise the Good Samaritans who want to save lives in the Channel by removing the for-gain clause, meaning that it's not just profiteering people traffickers who are deemed as criminals, but good, honest people trying to rescue drowning refugees. Lord's Amendment 20 reintroduces the for-gain, a move that we fully support. This brings me to the so-called pushback policy. Pushing back dinghies may well mean condemning refugees, including innocent children, to their deaths. This is an utterly barbaric proposal and again contravenes the law of the sea. We therefore support Lord's Amendment 54, which adds language to Schedule 6, stating that these enforcement powers must never put lives at risk. Madam Deputy Speaker, there's been profound concern that this legislation fails to comply with the United Nations Refugee Convention. Among them, the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights has criticised the legislation for undermining the human rights of refugees in a range of different ways. At a time when authoritarian regimes, such as Russia and China, are riding roughshod over international laws and norms, we must show that Britain, as a leading liberal democracy, is ready to lead by example. Britain must show that we stand with refugees and stand up for international law. We're therefore supporting Lord's Amendment 5, which would add a new clause stating that nothing in the bill must authorise policies which do not comply with the Refugee Convention.
Member for Giving Way. Would you like to tell the House what safe and legal routes the then Labour government opened up after the Second Iraq War? And maybe I'll help him with the answer. I don't think it was any.
Well, the safe and legal routes are not working, and they need to be made to work more effectively. We currently have thousands and thousands of Afghan refugees stuck in hotels. So let's put a system in place that actually works. I suggest looking forward is more effective than looking backwards to the Honourable Gentleman. Madam Deputy Speaker, another stark failure of this government has been the asylum waiting lists that are keeping refugees in limbo and costing the taxpayer dear. There are now over 100,000 people awaiting an initial decision on their asylum application, with an astonishing 61,864 people having had to wait 6 months or longer. These failures are less about capacity and more about a distinct lack of competence. The number of asylum seekers are fewer than the UK's recent peak, so the Home Office should be able to cope. However, under this Home Secretary, the system simply is not working. Lord's Amendment 7 offers a sensible proposal which could minimise the damage caused by the backlog, as it would provide asylum seekers with the right to work if their case has taken longer than 6 months. This would allow dignity to the asylum seekers, who can then earn their way and contribute, rather than being completely disempowered and excluded from the labour market. Lord's Amendment 7 would also prevent asylum seekers being forced into the dangerous net of the black market economy just to survive, which is so often more attractive to them than relying on the £38 per week from the government. Moreover, the government has already said that all Ukrainians can work here as soon as they arrive. So why is it a problem to allow other individuals and families fleeing terror the same opportunity? And if the government is worried about being seen to give asylum seekers work, it should fix the system so that applications are processed within 6 months. We are pleased to see that more than 66 Conservative parliamentarians, including 27 members of this House, have signed a letter to the Home Secretary expressing support for Amendment 7, and we encourage ministers to see the light and follow suit. Madam Deputy Speaker, the introduction last year of inadmissibility has only added further delays, because the government has failed to renegotiate a single returns policy with any country. Labelling asylum seekers as inadmissible for processing is effectively meaningless, as the asylum seeker cannot be returned. This simply adds 6 months of bureaucracy, uncertainty and confusion to the refugee, and a huge cost to the British taxpayer. Of the 8,593 notices of intent to deem people inadmissible that were issued in 2021, incredibly only 64 were upheld. This policy simply increases the enormous backlog further and is a complete waste of money. So we support Lord's Amendment 8. Madam Deputy Speaker, I now turn to perhaps the most unhinged element of this bill, the so-called offshoring provisions, which allow, theoretically at least, asylum seekers to be sent away to faraway lands for processing. The latest ludicrous suggestion is to use the Ascension Island, 4,500 miles away in the South Atlantic Sea. This is utter nonsense. It's operationally illiterate because it's so utterly impractical, and it's economically illiterate because it costs an eye-watering amount of taxpayers' money. Offshoring in Australia costs... I will give way.
Just to be very clear for the benefit of the House, the suggestion around the Ascension Island is untrue.
I thank the Minister for that intervention. Offshoring in Australia costs roughly $1 billion per year, and that's for about 300 people. Experts in Australia have also said that it was not effective as a deterrent, and that the vast majority of those offshored are now back in Australia due to mental and physical suffering. Rather than... I will give way.
I think if the Minister for Giving Way, he refers to only 300 people being linked to that offshore. Partly that's because the message has gone out to all of the many hundreds of thousands who might have attempted, but it's not worth trying.
Well, I don't think we're in control of which messages get out and which messages don't get out. It's about results and consequences, not about the process. And if the process isn't working, you need to fix it. Rather than fair, compassionate and orderly, this process would be cruel, demeaning and costly. This is why the Labour Party supports Lord's Amendment 9, which removes offshoring from the bill. And whilst we're on the topic of fairness and compassion, I should note our long-standing support for Lord's Amendment 10, which would allow unaccompanied children in Europe to join family members who are living lawfully in the UK. And at this point, I'd like to note my personal dismay at the bill's approach to victims of modern slavery, which again utterly contravenes the principles of fairness and compassion, and I very much look forward to my honourable friend's remarks on this later today. Madam Deputy Speaker, what is abundantly clear is there is little to no resilience built into Britain's asylum system. It's simply failing to adapt and to keep pace. It is also utterly inflexible at each point in the process. Ukrainian refugees are having to fill in 50 pages of paperwork in order to not be turned away, far beyond the necessary security checks. We have 100,000 person-long asylum waiting lists, and 12,000 Afghan refugees are stuck in hotels. Lord's Amendment 11 is a useful first step, and one we support. But with Putin's barbaric actions moving the goalposts almost every day, we would suggest the government moves further and faster in delivering a resilient system with the capacity that's required to adapt. A government that fails to plan is a government that plans to fail. And Lord's Amendment 11 would at least go some way to forcing the government to plan and to build capacity. And finally, Madam Deputy Speaker, while we feel that concessions given on Clause 9 are a welcome step forward, we remain unconvinced that the fears of those innocent citizens who feel at risk from this will have been allayed. It's still too vague, and we will be pushing that to the vote. I will give way.
I thank my honourable friend, and the reality is it's only after outrage and pushback that the government have been forced to concede on some of the most chilling aspects of this racist, divisive and discriminatory bill, including the removal of some of the carte blanche powers that were previously given to the Home Secretary. Does my honourable friend agree, however, that there are still serious concerns around due process, and in particular this notion that somebody can be stripped of their citizenship just because of our relations with another country?
I thank my honourable friend for giving way, and I must say I pay tribute to him and other colleagues who have led a passionate and powerful campaign on this issue, and I congratulate him. 324,963 signatures about this clause in the bill, Madam Deputy Speaker. I pay tribute to those who've campaigned. We will be voting for Lord's Amendment 4 today. Madam Deputy Speaker, I'd like to end by paying tribute to the noble lords. I will give him.
Very grateful, because at the start of his comments, I asked him what practical solutions his party had put forward, particularly to combat the boats coming across the Channel. He has skipped through lots and lots of amendments, in each case talking against government suggestions, not putting anything in his place. So can I give him this final opportunity before he sits down? What practical measures are his party suggesting to deal with the illegal and dangerous boats coming across the Channel? Because so far he's not come up with a single practical suggestion.
We're supporting every one of these amendments, almost all of which contain very practical suggestions. That is the policy of the Labour front bench. On the broader point, one thing we would do is not have a leader of our party who regularly and consistently insults our democratic partners and allies. And on that basis, we would negotiate a successor to Dublin. We would get constructive engagement with the French on security in terms of the people smugglers. It's about grown-up politics, as I'm sure the honourable member would wish to agree. Madam Deputy Speaker, I'd like to end by paying tribute to the noble lords and baronesses Coker, Stroud, Lister, Sousa, Rosser, Judge, Pannick, Kerr, Kirkhope, Dubbs, Alton, Newberger and Ritchie, for working cross-party in such a constructive and effective way to win so many votes in the other place. And let me be clear, this legislation reflects and represents a catalogue of failure on immigration policy, a combination of incompetence and indifference, from a government that's presiding over a system which is neither fair, compassionate nor orderly. It is a desperate attempt to distract from the Home Secretary's failings. It solves none of the challenges our immigration system faces. Madam Deputy Speaker, we know that many members on the government benches are deeply uncomfortable with the content of this legislation. The British people want and deserve an asylum immigration system that is fair, compassionate and orderly. Today, members on the government benches can stand up for decency by joining us in the division lobbies later this afternoon. Let us hope that they will do so.
Damien Green.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker.